Okay, let's dive right in. Severe mental illness and Christian theology. These are two massive, profound realities that often collide, and honestly, it can cause a lot of devastating confusion. But today, we're bringing some much-needed clarity to this really complex intersection. We're going to draw directly from some incredible, comprehensive insights provided by gotquestions.org to figure out exactly how the Bible and modern Christian thought approach the stark reality of schizophrenia. It's a sensitive subject for sure. It's deeply nuanced, and it touches so many families. But look, by breaking this information down systematically, we can actually strip away the stigma and gain a tremendous amount of clarity on how to navigate this whole thing with both truth and grace. Because this is such a weighty topic, we're going to move through 5 structured steps. We'll start by defining the disorder, searching for the cause, looking at the spiritual debates, exploring what it means to be in a prison of the mind, and finally, finding hope and healing.
All right, Section 1, defining the disorder. Let's establish exactly what we're talking about before we get into the theology.
So you might be wondering right off the bat, does the Bible actually mention schizophrenia explicitly? Well, the short answer is no. You aren't going to find that exact clinical term anywhere in the ancient texts. But, and this is crucial, the biblical worldview doesn't just ignore the immense suffering associated with it. Not at all. The scriptures talk extensively about human anguish, mental torment, and our profound need for compassion and healing. So, even without modern medical terminology, the Bible lays a really deeply relevant foundation for how we should respond today.
Now, schizophrenia is not just feeling a little down or going through a rough patch. It is a profound, truly debilitating psychological disorder. We're talking about a chronic, life-altering affliction. It involves hearing voices, severe hallucinations, delusions, disorganized thinking, and just extreme paranoia that can completely disrupt a person's everyday life. The mental health field rightly considers it a severe psychotic disorder because it literally fractures a person's perception of reality. And that's exactly why it's typically treated with pretty heavy psychotropic medications, just to help manage these incredibly overwhelming and terrifying symptoms.
Pop culture has unfortunately fueled a massive misconception for decades, and we need to clear this up right now. Schizophrenia is entirely distinct from dissociative identity disorder, which most folks casually call a split personality. Someone battling schizophrenia is not harboring multiple distinct personalities inside themselves. Nope. Instead, the condition is fundamentally about disorganized thinking and a fractured perception of the world. Their single identity is just struggling to process reality. It's not splitting into different people.
Section 2, searching for the cause. Now that we know what it is, why is this disorder so incredibly difficult to pin down?
Well, part of the problem is there's no simple physical test for it. You can't just do a routine blood draw or a definitive brain scan. So medical research relies heavily on theory to explain why this happens. The exact origins, they remain deeply elusive. Researchers do point strongly to genetic factors, as well as brain abnormalities that actually kind of mirror degenerative conditions like Alzheimer's or dementia. And tragically, there's another major factor: illicit drug abuse. Powerful narcotics can sometimes leave behind permanent, irreversible brain dysfunction that perfectly mimics these severe psychotic symptoms long after the drugs are actually out of the system.
This brings us to Section 3, the spiritual debate. How exactly should Christians view this level of disruption?
Because of the really drastic behavioral changes and those terrifying hallucinations we talked about, some well-meaning folks jump to the conclusion that the root cause must be purely spiritual. Specifically, they think it's demon possession. But wait, when you objectively compare biblical accounts of possession, like the one detailed in Luke 4:41, to documented clinical cases of schizophrenia, the symptoms simply do not align. The source material strongly emphasizes that biblical accounts of spiritual warfare present distinctly different characteristics than the disorganized thought processes of this specific psychological disorder.
And this is a really critical warning for anyone trying to offer counsel or care. Because underlying causes vary so wildly from one person to the next, we have got to resist the urge to oversimplify things. Humans are incredibly complex, right? We're made up of interwoven biology, psychology, and spirituality. So forcing someone's genuine clinical suffering into a strictly spiritual box, or dismissing their spiritual needs by shoving them into a strictly physical box, that can do profound damage. We literally have to be willing to hold both of those realities in tension.
Section 4, a prison of the mind. This reality really demands our deepest empathy.
The source material uses a really stark, unforgettable phrase to describe this condition. It calls it a prison of the mind. I mean, just imagine for a second the isolating terror of not being able to trust your own senses or your own thoughts, when the very instrument you use to perceive reality, your brain, is telling you things that simply aren't true.
You become trapped in an invisible cell. It's a level of exhaustion and fear that honestly most of us just cannot fathom. And it requires incredible patience and compassion from those of us on the outside.
And sadly, this is where the tragedy really compounds. These individuals and their absolutely exhausted families frequently find themselves stranded in this lonely no man's land. The medical community doesn't have all the absolute answers or cures, and unfortunately, the Christian community often lacks the clinical literacy to offer really effective support. This devastating gap is exactly why the church has to view severe mental illness not as some taboo topic to avoid, but as a vital mission field. A mission field desperately in need of gospel hope, practical support, and totally judgment-free love.
Finally, Section 5, Hope and Healing. Let's see what holistic resolution actually looks like from a biblical perspective.
God absolutely does not desire anyone to remain in hopeless suffering. Now, while he certainly can and does work through sudden miraculous intervention, he equally extends his healing hand through very practical, common grace avenues. Things like modern psychotropic medications, medical procedures, professional psychological counseling, and even healthy environmental changes. These are all incredibly valid God-given tools. Using these treatments isn't a lack of faith at all. Actually, it's a wise stewardship of the medical resources he has allowed humanity to develop over the years.
Furthermore, the isolating nature of a mental health diagnosis never, ever separates a person from God's redemptive promises. Christ still offers profound rest to the heavy-laden and mentally exhausted, just like he promises in Matthew 11. Romans 10 still steadfastly promises salvation to absolutely anyone who calls upon his name, no matter what their psychological state is. And Jesus still promises the hope of a more abundant life in John 10. These anchors, they hold firm, even when a person's mind feels completely unmoored.
To wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a really provocative thought based on the book of James. Believers are commanded to care for the vulnerable without favoritism and without fear. So how will you step up today? How will you bring love, hope, and the reality of the gospel to those currently trapped in a prison of the mind? It's a challenging call to action, but man, is it an absolutely necessary one. Thank you so much for joining me to explore this incredibly complex and important topic.